Please be advised the following material is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This report contains the exact federal courtroom testimony from the Sean Diddy Combs trial, as documented by Inner City Press. The high-profile trial of Sean Diddy Combs took a turn no one could have predicted. What began as another day of procedural testimony erupted into chaos when Diddy himself launched a shocking outburst in response to damaging financial evidence. The result? A severe warning from Judge Eleanor Michaels, who made it clear that another disruption could cost him his seat in the courtroom entirely. Inside Courtroom 17B, the air had been thick with tension from the moment proceedings began. Diddy, seated at the defense table with his elite legal team, had maintained a composed exterior throughout most of the trial. Dressed sharply, his posture calm, he looked like the epitome of controlled professionalism. But beneath the surface, pressure had been building. The prosecution had called Melissa Richardson to the stand, a name that had been circulating in legal circles for weeks. As the former financial controller for Combs Enterprises, her testimony was expected to be technical but potent. What nobody expected was the depth and clarity of her analysis, which would go on to unravel a financial web allegedly connecting Diddy to acts of witness intimidation, fraud, and racketeering. Richardson began calmly, establishing her role and responsibilities from 2016 to 2023. She had managed financial reporting, internal audits, and compliance procedures across Diddy's empire, covering fashion brands, music labels, and media ventures. At first, her testimony remained procedural, explaining how Combs Enterprises maintained separate financial systems for different divisions. This segmentation, she noted, was not unusual for large corporations. But the tone shifted dramatically when she was directed to a document labeled Government Exhibit 247. It was a series of quarterly intercompany transfer reports, showing how funds moved between Combs subsidiaries and offshore entities. What made this document critical was a specific financial category marked as Special Talent Development. The phrase sounded innocuous, but as Richardson explained, it was anything but. This category, according to her testimony, allowed expenditures to bypass standard approval protocols. It required direct authorization from only a handful of people, Diddy himself being one of them. She noted that these payments often exceeded $100,000 and were not supported by contracts, invoices, or any of the usual deliverables expected in corporate transactions. As she continued, Richardson began linking these payments to specific events, dates that matched testimony from alleged victims who claimed to have been threatened or coerced. She even highlighted a pattern where funds totaling more than $2.3 million moved through 4 shell companies before reaching people previously identified as enforcers. When asked about the purpose of these transfers, Richardson didn't speculate. She presented the pattern: high-value payments with no documentation, routed through obscure paths, all signed off by Diddy himself. As she spoke, Diddy's attorneys frequently objected, attempting to halt the mounting damage. Judge Michaels overruled most of these objections, allowing Richardson to proceed. The pivotal moment came when prosecutor Amanda Winters presented text messages between Richardson and Diddy. These messages showed him instructing her to handle financial anomalies by creating and backdating documents. One message stood out, where Diddy allegedly told her to handle it like the others, suggesting a systematic process for covering tracks. As this line was read aloud, Diddy exploded. He stood up, slammed his hands on the table, and yelled across the courtroom. His voice cut through the air like a blade, accusing Richardson of lying and stealing from the company. The courtroom froze. Gasps echoed. Richardson remained seated, maintaining her composure as court officers and attorneys tried to calm the situation. Judge Michaels acted instantly. She ordered Diddy to sit, warning him in front of everyone that one more outburst would result in a contempt of court ruling. Her tone was unwavering. She reminded him that his fame, money, and power had no bearing in her courtroom. Diddy, still visibly agitated, hesitated before slowly lowering himself back into his seat. His jaw clenched, his eyes locked on Richardson. The judge then addressed the jury, instructing them to disregard the outburst entirely. The courtroom recessed for a brief moment. During that time, Judge Michaels called both legal teams to the bench. Observers noted that she spoke firmly, occasionally pointing toward Diddy, while the attorneys listened closely. When the court resumed, Richardson returned to the stand without missing a beat. Prosecutor Winters continued her questioning, steering back to the financial patterns. Richardson explained how two distinct accounting systems operated within Commas Enterprises. One above board with regular approvals and audits, the other reserved for covert transactions. She emphasized how funds categorized under special talent development or executive security were often fragmented across various departments to avoid scrutiny. She testified about raising compliance concerns starting in 2017. Those concerns, she said, were brushed off by higher-ups and later escalated directly to Diddy, who allegedly warned her that pressing further would be detrimental to her career. As this testimony unfolded, Diddy remained quiet but tense. His attorneys sat close, whispering occasionally. Every objection they raised was measured and technical, focusing on language rather than content. Their goal seemed clear: control the narrative without further provoking Judge Michaels. Richardson then introduced the concept of information containment protocols, directives that told staff to process payments without asking questions. These requests often came with urgent instructions and lacked paper trails. The judge kept a close eye on Diddy throughout. Her gaze returned to him regularly, ensuring her previous warning had not been forgotten. Her control of the courtroom was absolute. She allowed Richardson to proceed uninterrupted unless an objection warranted her intervention. The prosecution then moved toward tying these financial anomalies to a broader infrastructure of protection. Expenditures disguised as strategic partnerships or industry relations were, according to Richardson, meant to create a buffer zone around Diddy, an ecosystem that could deflect or suppress scrutiny. As she described how money was funneled through private security firms and consultants with ties to known intimidators, the courtroom grew increasingly focused. The weight of the testimony was undeniable, and all eyes returned repeatedly to Diddy, who remained rigid, eyes locked ahead. Then came the text messages again, the ones that had triggered Diddy's first outburst. This time, Prosecutor Winters approached them with even more caution. She read aloud another directive allegedly sent by Diddy to Richardson. "Either handle it or I'll find someone who will. Your job is fixing problems, not creating them." That was the breaking point. Once more, Diddy stood, pointing at Richardson, accusing her of twisting the truth and of embezzlement. His attorney stood as well, trying to block his path and de-escalate the situation. The room erupted. Murmurs from observers, shuffling from reporters, and court officers rushing forward. Judge Michaels's gavel slammed down multiple times. She shouted for order, her voice cutting through the frenzy. When silence returned, she turned to Diddy and delivered the judgment that would echo through the legal community. She found him in contempt of court. A $10,000 fine was imposed immediately. She warned him again, more sternly than before, that one more disruption would remove him from the courtroom entirely. He would be forced to watch the remainder of the trial from a holding cell via video link. Diddy's attorneys protested, citing his constitutional right to be present. The judge shut it down. She reminded them, and everyone in that room, that the Supreme Court allows removal when behavior disrupts due process. She addressed the jury again, stating that these disruptions were not evidence and must not influence their judgment. She reminded them that only the facts, presented legally and properly, mattered. The courtroom took a 30-minute recess. During that time, Diddy's attorneys huddled around him, speaking in hushed tones. The shift in strategy was visible. What started as a defense rooted in legal objections and cross-examinations was now a crisis response effort, focused on damage control and preserving the trial's integrity. As the court prepared to resume, everyone in the room knew the tone of the trial had changed forever. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had shifted. The energy in the room was no longer procedural. It was tense, alert, and fully focused. Additional court officers now stood at key positions around the room. Diddy had returned in a different suit, possibly a calculated move by his legal team to reset the visual impression he was giving to the jury. His posture was tight, shoulders squared, and his eyes remained locked forward. Gone was the confident executive. In his place sat a man now clearly aware of how much was at stake. Judge Michaels entered and immediately reasserted control. She reminded the courtroom of her prior warning. Then, turning directly to Diddy, she made it abundantly clear: his continued presence in the courtroom was conditional. Any further disruption would mean he would be removed permanently and observe the remainder of the trial from a cell via video feed. She then issued another directive to his legal team. It was their responsibility to maintain their client's courtroom behavior. His rights did not override the court's obligation to ensure a fair and orderly trial. With those terms laid down, the prosecution resumed. Richardson, calm and poised, took the stand once again. Prosecutor Winters was careful to avoid immediately returning to the text messages that had triggered the earlier chaos. Instead, she directed the line of questioning toward broader financial patterns within Comma's enterprises. Patterns that suggested systemic misuse of funds cloaked under layers of corporate procedure. Richardson described how the company operated what she termed parallel financial systems. Standard business transactions followed regular accounting rules, with appropriate approvals, documentation, and compliance oversight. However, another financial stream, much less transparent, was reserved for sensitive categories like special talent development, executive security, and strategic relationship management. These expenditures, Richardson testified, were frequently broken up into smaller amounts, routed through multiple companies, and kept just under reporting thresholds that might trigger regulatory review. More concerning was that these unusual transactions were approved only by a very limited number of individuals, primarily Diddy himself. The structure appeared, in her words, designed for concealment, not operational efficiency. As she continued, she testified that she had raised concerns about these practices as early as 2017. Initially, she had reported to the company's CFO, who instructed her to continue basic documentation but halt further investigation. When she pressed further and took her concerns directly to Diddy, she claimed to have been warned off with language that strongly suggested any continued scrutiny could damage her career trajectory. Throughout this part of her testimony, Diddy sat visibly tense. He remained silent, but the strain was obvious. His jaw was clenched. His foot bounced intermittently. Every so often, he scribbled a note to his attorneys. Still, he maintained enough control to avoid repeating the earlier mistake. His lawyers, for their part, raised objections occasionally. They challenged some of the terminology used by Richardson, suggesting she was drawing conclusions beyond her expertise. Judge Michaels overruled most of these objections, pointing out that Richardson's credentials and years of direct experience with the financial system of the organization gave her the foundation to testify about what she observed firsthand. The next major moment came when Richardson introduced internal audits from 2019. These audits had flagged specific financial transactions categorized under special talent development and security consultation as high risk. She testified that she presented one such audit to Diddy directly. His response, according to her, was to discontinue the audit and reassign the audit team to other divisions. The courtroom grew even more quiet as she detailed a series of transactions totaling $14.7 million. These transactions matched the dates and events previously described by alleged victims of intimidation and coercion. The timing, pattern, and routing of the funds were nearly identical in each instance. Large sums were transferred from Comma's main holding company to subsidiaries, then routed through offshore entities, and finally landed in domestic accounts controlled by individuals named in earlier witness testimony. Winters asked her whether these transactions bore any legitimate business purpose. Richardson responded that in her professional opinion, they did not. They had no deliverables, no contracts, and no standard documentation. They were coded in ways that disguised their intent. To the financial eye, they looked manufactured. She then brought forward another piece of documentation, an internal email exchange between herself and Diddy. This message had been recovered from company devices and had already been submitted as evidence. In this exchange, Richardson warned Diddy that auditors required proper paperwork for a series of questionable expenditures. His response was firm. Handle it like the others. Create the paperwork. Backdate it. No one questions what they think they've already seen. There was a pause in the courtroom as the weight of that message hung in the air. Unlike emotional testimony or hearsay, this was hard documentation. And Diddy, this time, remained seated. His attorney placed a hand on his arm when the quote was read aloud, but there was no explosion. Only silence. But his expression had changed. Eyes narrowed, face tight, fists slightly clenched under the table. Prosecutor Winters continued, asking Richardson how she had responded to that message. She stated that she had warned Diddy about the implications of creating fraudulent documentation. She told him it could constitute fraud and violate both company policy and federal compliance law. His reply, she said, was equally blunt. Either fix the problem or I'll find someone who will. Remember who helped your career and who can end it. The room shifted again. There were audible murmurs among observers. Richardson maintained her composure, while Diddy's attorneys scrambled to object. They argued this portion of testimony was speculative and prejudicial. Judge Michaels allowed it, noting again that these were direct quotes from documented communications between an employee and the defendant. Diddy's control began to slip again. Though he didn't speak out loud, his breathing became visibly heavy. His eyes darted between the judge and his attorneys. He whispered something to one of them, who leaned in close, whispering back firmly. The earlier contempt ruling was clearly fresh in everyone's minds. Even a single word could now have irreversible consequences. Winters moved forward with additional messages that followed Richardson's refusal to create fake documents. One text read, "Your job is solving problems, not creating them. Why are we even having this conversation?" The message ended with a veiled threat, one that suggested Richardson's future at the company would be over if she didn't comply. Richardson explained to the court that shortly after this exchange, she was reassigned, her audit access restricted, and her department reduced in scope. Within months, her employment was terminated. Diddy's defense seized on this moment during cross-examination. His lead attorney shifted the tone, becoming more methodical and calm. He began asking Richardson about the nature of her departure from the company. He implied there had been discrepancies under her watch. Perhaps, he suggested, she had her own reasons for testifying now. But Richardson stood firm. She explained that her termination came after she documented compliance concerns and refused to participate in what she considered unethical practices. When asked if she had filed any wrongful termination or whistleblower claim, she responded that she had chosen not to, believing it would be used to attack her credibility. She had instead documented everything and turned it over to federal investigators when the case against Diddy was opened. The cross-examination continued, focusing on technical aspects of accounting practices. Diddy's attorney attempted to frame the unique financial categories as standard in high-profile entertainment businesses, companies that often had to maintain privacy for their talent, consultants, and contractors. Richardson, however, pushed back. She noted that in every legitimate organization she had worked with, even the most confidential expenditures were still documented. Contracts were signed, services were verified, approvals were documented. What she observed at Commas Enterprises was not enhanced confidentiality, but total circumvention of oversight. As the day progressed, Judge Michaels kept a tight grip on courtroom order. Any question that appeared leading or overly repetitive was cut off. The court remained disciplined and alert. Her earlier warning still hovered over every word spoken. Before the session ended, Richardson made one final point that landed heavily. She testified about a separate series of payments made to a firm owned by Michael Grayson, a man who had already been named by previous witnesses as being involved in surveillance and intimidation. These payments totaled $1.3 million and were processed within 48 hours of specific individuals being approached or allegedly threatened. Richardson explained that despite the size of the payments, they never appeared on standard financial reports. Instead, they were processed through a different system, one that required an 8-digit approval code that only Diddy possessed. As this final detail was presented, silence returned to the room. Diddy remained motionless, but the tension in his face was unmistakable. Judge Michaels called for adjournment, reminding everyone that proceedings would resume the following morning. As court dismissed, Diddy left surrounded by his legal team, their pace brisk, their expressions serious. What had begun as a courtroom strategy of challenging witness credibility and poking holes in testimony had now transformed into damage control. Diddy's outbursts had not only drawn judicial sanctions, but they had also strengthened the prosecution's case by highlighting how damaging the testimony truly was. In the eyes of the jury, the emotional reactions may have done more to validate Richardson's testimony than the evidence itself. And with the trial only halfway through, the pressure was only intensifying. As the new day of trial commenced, the Manhattan Federal Courthouse was already under heavy attention. Media vans lined the block. Security was heightened. The events of the previous day had shifted this trial from a financial investigation into a battle of courtroom control. Diddy, now wearing a conservative dark suit, entered quietly. His demeanor was subdued. He spoke only to his attorneys, never looking toward the gallery or reporters. The transformation from defiant celebrity to restrained defendant was complete. Two new attorneys appeared at the defense table that morning, both known specialists in appellate law and judicial procedure. It was a clear signal that Diddy's legal team was not only managing the trial, but also preparing for potential appeals. Their presence reinforced how consequential the courtroom dynamic had become after the contempt ruling. Judge Michaels entered with her usual punctuality. Before calling the next witness, she addressed the court. She reminded all parties that previous conduct had required judicial intervention. She emphasized that the courtroom would continue under appropriate decorum and respect for process. The message was firm, not just to the defense, but to everyone in the room. Order would be preserved at all costs. The prosecution resumed by introducing testimony from forensic accountants who had analyzed the same financial records presented by Melissa Richardson. These professionals corroborated her analysis, using independent data and third-party verification to demonstrate how funds had moved through Contempt enterprises. They outlined methods of financial concealment, complex transaction routing, and patterns consistent with deliberate obfuscation. One witness, a forensic auditor from the IRS, explained how payments were split into irregular sums, disguised as vendor payments, and timed to coincide with key dates involving prior witness activity. Another expert presented flowcharts tracking money from Contempt's core accounts to offshore shell companies and back to U.S. entities owned by individuals previously named in testimony. As this testimony unfolded, Diddy remained quiet, his expression unreadable. He wrote notes, leaned in occasionally to whisper with counsel, but made no visible emotional display. The change in his behavior was obvious. Observers noted that even during the most damning pieces of evidence, his control held firm. But that restraint came at a cost. Legal analysts watching the proceedings pointed out a new imbalance. While the prosecution had freedom to build its case, the defense now had to operate within a narrow range. Any aggressive tactic, any objection that seemed too confrontational, could risk antagonizing the judge further. The courtroom had shifted into what analysts described as asymmetric tension. The defense objected occasionally, but with caution. Their strategy appeared to be containment, raising only those objections necessary to preserve issues for appeal. They no longer interrupted rhythmically to break the prosecution's flow. Each word was chosen, each move calculated. By mid-morning, the focus returned to the impact of Diddy's previous courtroom outburst. Several jury consultants began weighing in through media commentary. One analyst described a phenomenon known as the credibility echo, where a defendant's emotional reaction to specific testimony unintentionally validates that testimony in the minds of jurors. The question being asked across newsrooms and legal panels was simple. Why did Diddy lose control during Melissa Richardson's testimony? What truth had hit so hard that he couldn't remain composed? The prosecution subtly leaned into that narrative as they introduced emails and records confirming Diddy's direct involvement in financial approvals. A spreadsheet highlighted the use of a personal authorization code, unique, traceable, and used exclusively by Diddy for transactions above $50,000. Another exhibit, a series of encrypted emails between executives, showed how high-value expenditures were coordinated through back channels. They discussed payments labeled as security consulting, yet connected to events where intimidation had been alleged. In one particular exchange, an executive asked for approval to wire funds to a company called Veritas Strategic, citing urgent security needs. The amount was $220,000. Diddy's reply came back within minutes. Approved. No further context, no documentation, just a green light. Prosecutors noted that Veritas Strategic had no office, no website, and no identifiable personnel. It was a shell. As this thread unfolded, Diddy's legal team pushed back. They argued that wealthy individuals often maintain layers of security and use private vendors for legitimate services. They cited examples from other entertainment figures who operate in high-risk environments. But the prosecution wasn't claiming the payments were suspicious based on content alone. They were arguing that the structure of these payments, lack of documentation, routing methods, timing, and language used in internal communication, collectively suggested something far beyond normal business practices. In the afternoon session, the prosecution shifted back to Richardson's testimony, this time through a reinforcement strategy. A former assistant controller from Contempt Enterprises took the stand. She confirmed many of the irregularities Richardson had raised. She explained that questions about special talent development payments were discouraged. When asked who had final say on such payments, her answer was short. Always Mr. Contempt. She added that in several cases, employees who questioned these transactions were reassigned or pressured to remain silent. One colleague, she said, resigned after being asked to sign off on payments without supporting documents. As the day progressed, legal commentators began discussing the broader implications of the contempt finding. They noted that Judge Michaels had drawn a line that many judges hesitate to draw, publicly holding a high-profile defendant accountable in real time. That decision had changed everything. Now, every glance, every word from the defense was filtered through that lens. Were they trying to salvage the case, or were they laying groundwork for appeal? Either way, the focus had shifted from simply defending against the charges to managing the trial's perception and integrity. When court recessed briefly, news outlets jumped on the story. Headlines weren't about spreadsheets or accounting. They were about power and its limits. How Diddy, a mogul with decades of media mastery, had lost control in the one place where influence doesn't bend the rules, federal court. When proceedings resumed, the judge announced she would allow one final witness from the prosecution before the defense could begin its case. The witness was an external auditor from a consulting firm hired briefly by Commas Enterprises in 2021. This auditor had flagged multiple financial inconsistencies during a routine compliance review, including several of the same special category payments discussed during trial. He testified that his report had been returned with requests for edits. When he declined to change findings without further investigation, the contract with his firm was not renewed. The implication was clear. Uncomfortable scrutiny had been systematically avoided. As this final witness concluded, the prosecution rested its case. Judge Michaels announced that the defense would begin the following morning. Before adjourning, she issued one final statement for the day. She reminded all parties, again, that disruptions would not be tolerated. Her tone was measured but final. As court adjourned, Diddy exited with his team, passing a hallway lined with reporters. Cameras captured his rigid expression, the attorneys shielding him as best they could from the barrage of questions. Legal commentators described his body language as defensive, guarded, and tense. Not the image of a man in control. Outside the courtroom, the narrative was already taking shape. News anchors recounted the contempt ruling, the explosive outburst, and the damning financial connections. Analysts debated whether Diddy's earlier reactions had done irreparable damage to his defense. Behind closed doors, his attorneys reportedly held extended strategy sessions. Sources close to the defense revealed that they were exploring every procedural safeguard. Could they request a change of venue? Could they file for mistrial based on emotional bias? Were the judge's sanctions too harsh? The legal team was working every angle, but all paths now depended on Diddy's ability to maintain absolute control. For someone who had built an empire on charisma, dominance, and narrative control, this courtroom was a foreign world. Here, everything came down to procedure, evidence, and behavior. No entourage, no stage, no script. The contrast between Diddy's media persona and his current reality had never been starker. Once known for commanding attention in arenas, award shows, and global campaigns, he now had to defer entirely to a single judge with a wooden gavel and federal authority. That reality was the true weight bearing down on him. As the trial moved toward the defense's opening, the stakes were higher than ever. The prosecution had laid out a comprehensive financial trail, supported by documents, witnesses, and expert analysis. They had shown not just misconduct, but intentional concealment, control, and reaction under pressure. Diddy's team now faced the ultimate challenge: how to dismantle a case already bolstered by the defendant's own behavior. It wasn't just about rebutting evidence. It was about regaining credibility, reframing narratives, and somehow convincing a jury that what they had seen and heard wasn't what it appeared to be. And with the judge watching closely, one more misstep could silence Diddy's voice in the courtroom for good. As the final gavel fell for the day, observers knew one thing for certain. This trial wasn't just about crimes alleged. It was about power, truth, and control. And in that courtroom, only one authority mattered: the bench.